In Albert Einstein's study, there were 3 portraits on the wall. 3 faces that the greatest scientist of the 20th century chose to look at every single day. One was Isaac Newton. One was James Clerk Maxwell. And the third was a man who never went to school. A man who started his life binding books in a tiny shop. A man whose name most people today have never heard. His name was Michael Faraday. And without him, the world you live in right now would not exist. I am so glad you are here with me today. Take a deep breath. Let your shoulders relax. And let this story carry you gently through time to a cold, dark street in London, where a boy with no money, no education, and no future is about to change everything. The year was 1791. In a poor part of South London, a baby boy was born into a family that had almost nothing. His father, James Faraday, was a blacksmith, a man who shaped hot iron with a hammer and his bare hands. But James was often too sick to work. The family moved from one cheap room to another, always struggling, always hungry. Some weeks, young Michael received a single loaf of bread, 1 loaf, and that loaf had to last him 7 days. He went to a very basic school for a few years. He learned to read. He learned to write. He learned basic mathematics. That was all. His family could not afford anything more. When he was 13 years old, the classroom was over for him. He needed to earn money. He found a job as an errand boy for a man named George Rebo, who owned a small bookshop and bookbinding workshop in London. Michael's job was easy. Deliver newspapers, sweep the floors, carry packages back and forth across the city. A year later, when Michael turned 14, Rebo made him an apprentice. An apprentice is someone who works for a master craftsman in order to learn a trade. For the next 7 years, Michael would learn the craft of bookbinding, taking loose sheets of paper and stitching them together with needle and thread, pressing them between leather covers, shaping piles of scattered pages into solid, beautiful books. It was quiet, careful work. His hands learned to fold paper. His fingers learned to pull thread tight. His eyes learned to line up edges perfectly. Day after day, he stood at the workbench, surrounded by the smell of leather and glue and fresh ink. But here is the thing that changed everything. Michael Faraday did not just bind the books. He read them. Every science book that came into the shop he opened. Every article about chemistry or electricity he studied. He read late into the night by candlelight in his small room above the shop. One book in particular opened a door in his mind, a science book called Conversations on Chemistry, written by a woman named Jane Marcet. It explained chemistry in plain, clear language that anyone could understand. Michael read it once, then he read it again and again. Each time, the invisible world of atoms and forces and energy opened a little wider in his mind. He did not just read either. He experimented. He saved the few coins he earned and bought cheap materials, wires, glass bottles, small pieces of metal. He built tiny machines in the back of the bookshop. He tested the ideas he had read about with his own hands. The bookbinder's workshop became his secret laboratory. But reading alone was not enough. Faraday wanted to see real science, to watch it happen with his own eyes. And in 1812, he got his chance. A customer at the bookshop gave Michael a ticket to a series of lectures at the Royal Institution, one of the most famous scientific organizations in London. The speaker was Sir Humphry Davy, the most celebrated scientist in England at that time. Davy was brilliant, charming, and famous. He had discovered several new chemical elements. He had invented a safety lamp that saved the lives of coal miners. He was a star of the scientific world. Michael sat in the audience and listened with his entire being. He did not just listen, he watched every movement of Davy's hands. He wrote down every word. He drew careful diagrams of every experiment. When the 4 lectures were over, Michael went home and did something that only a bookbinder would think of doing. He took his notes, over 300 pages of careful writing and detailed drawings, and he bound them into a book. A beautiful book with a leather cover and neat gold lettering. Then he wrote a letter to Humphrey Davy. He explained that he was a poor young man who wanted, more than anything, to leave the world of trade and enter the world of science. He said he was willing to do any work, no matter how small, and he sent the letter together with the bound notebook. Davy read the notebook. He was impressed. He showed it to a friend and asked, "What should I do with this boy?" The friend replied, "Let him wash bottles. If he is good enough for science, he will accept the work. If he refuses, he is not good enough." In March of 1813, Michael Faraday, 21 years old, with no degree, no education, and no connections, walked through the doors of the Royal Institution as a laboratory assistant. His job was to clean glass equipment, prepare chemicals, light the fires, and help the real scientists with their experiments. He was given a small room in the building to live in. He earned less money than he had made as a bookbinder. But none of that mattered. He was inside. He was in the room where science happened. He could watch, he could listen, he could learn, and that was all he had ever wanted. Soon after, Davy invited Faraday to join him on a long journey across Europe, visiting scientists and laboratories in France, Italy, Switzerland, and Belgium. It was an amazing opportunity. Faraday would meet some of the greatest minds in the world. He would see experiments he had only read about in books. But the journey came with a price. Davy's wife, Lady Davy, refused to treat Faraday as an equal. She treated him like a servant. She made him eat with the other servants. She ordered him to carry her bags. She spoke to him as if he were nothing. For a proud young man who dreamed of being a scientist, it was deeply painful. Faraday suffered in silence. He watched. He learned. He filled his notebooks. And when they returned to London 18 months later, he went back to his laboratory with a quiet fire burning inside him, a determination that no amount of disrespect could put out. Over the next few years, Faraday worked with a focus and care that amazed everyone around him. He arrived early. He stayed late. He recorded every experiment with great care and detail. Slowly, Davy trusted him with more important work. And slowly, Faraday began to make his own discoveries. In 1821, he built something that had never existed before. He took a wire, a magnet, and a bowl of liquid mercury. He set them up on his workbench, connected a battery, and watched. The wire began to move. It spun slowly around the magnet, pushed by nothing but the invisible force of electricity. No hand touched it. No spring drove it. It moved on its own. It was small. It was simple. And it was the first electric motor in history. Think about that for a moment. Every machine that runs on an electric motor today, every fan, every washing machine, every electric car, every factory, every train traces its beginning back to this one moment. A young man with no formal education, standing alone in a basement laboratory, watching a wire spin in a bowl of mercury. The discovery made Faraday famous among scientists, but it also created a problem he did not expect. Humphrey Davy, his teacher, his protector, the man who had opened the door for him, became jealous. Some people accused Faraday of stealing ideas from other scientists. The accusation was unfair, but Davy, instead of defending his student, stayed silent. And when Faraday was recommended for membership in the Royal Society, the most important scientific organization in Britain, Davy voted against him. He was the only one. The man who had opened the door was now trying to close it. But the other scientists saw the truth. Faraday was elected anyway, in 1824. He simply kept working. And then, in 1831, came the discovery that changed the modern world. For years, Faraday had been thinking about electricity and magnetism. Other scientists had shown that electricity could create a magnetic force. But could the opposite be done? Could a magnet create electricity? Nobody had been able to do it. On the 29th of August, 1831, Faraday sat alone in his laboratory. He wrapped 2 coils of copper wire around an iron ring. He connected one coil to a battery. He connected the other coil to a small measuring instrument, a device with a tiny needle that could detect the smallest flow of electricity. Then he turned the battery on, and he watched. The needle jumped. Just for an instant, a tiny movement, barely visible. Then it stopped. Faraday stared at it. He turned the battery off. The needle jumped again. His hands were shaking. He knew what he had just seen. That tiny jump was one of the most important moments in the history of science. Faraday had discovered electromagnetic induction, the principle that a changing magnetic force can create electricity in a wire. This one discovery is the foundation of every power station, every generator, every transformer that has ever existed. Every time you turn on a light, charge your phone, or plug anything into a wall, you are using what Michael Faraday found that day in his laboratory. He had unlocked the key to the modern world, and he had done it with his hands, his eyes, and his deep understanding of nature without a single mathematical equation. This is one of the most remarkable things about Faraday. He had almost no training in mathematics. He could not write the equations that described his own discoveries. He thought in pictures and lines of force, in invisible fields spreading through space like ripples in water. He could see things that other scientists, buried in their numbers and formulas, simply could not imagine. Years later, a brilliant young Scottish scientist named James Clerk Maxwell took Faraday's ideas and translated them into the language of mathematics. Maxwell's equations became one of the foundations of modern physics, and Maxwell himself said that he had only written down in numbers what Faraday had already seen with his mind. And Einstein? Einstein called Faraday's work the greatest change in the foundations of physics since Newton. That is why Faraday's portrait hung on Einstein's wall, not because Faraday was famous, but because he had seen the truth before anyone else could even ask the right questions. But fame did not change Michael Faraday, and this is perhaps the most beautiful part of his story. The Queen of England offered him a knighthood. He said no. The Royal Society offered him the presidency, the highest honor in British science, not once, but twice. He said no, both times. He was even offered a place in Westminster Abbey to be buried beside Isaac Newton himself. He said no. He asked for a simple grave, with a plain stone, and nothing more. He continued to live in his small rooms at the Royal Institution, the same building where he had once washed bottles as a young assistant. He continued to give lectures, including a famous series of Christmas lectures designed especially for children, where he used clear, exciting experiments to show young people the wonders of science. A candle flame, a piece of ice, a magnet, and some iron filings. He made science feel like magic. He believed that knowledge belonged to everyone, not just the wealthy and the educated. He had been that poor boy once, the boy pressing his face against the window of a world he could not afford to enter. He never forgot where he came from. In his final years, Faraday's memory began to fail him. The chemicals he had worked with for decades had likely damaged his mind. He forgot things. He lost his concentration. He could no longer do the work he loved. For a man whose entire life had been built on careful observation, it was a cruel ending. But even then, he remained gentle, kind, and grateful for the life science had given him. Michael Faraday died on the 25th of August, 1867. He was 75 years old. He was buried in Highgate Cemetery in London, under a simple stone with his name. No grand monument, no marble angels, just a name and the silence of a man who had never wanted attention, only truth. And so, my friends, the story of the bookbinder who lit up the world comes gently to its close. Faraday never went to university. He never earned a degree. He could not write the equations that described his own discoveries. But he had something no school could give him, and no one could take away. He had curiosity, a deep, patient, burning curiosity that turned a bookbinding workshop into a laboratory, a loaf of bread into a week of survival, and a bound notebook into the key that opened every door in his life. And that is what I want you to remember. Not the science, not the equations. The notebook. A poor boy with nothing to offer, except his hunger to learn, sat down, took 300 pages of careful notes, and bound them into a book. He sent that book to a man he admired, and that single act of courage, that one notebook, changed the course of history. You are building your own notebook right now, my friend. Every word you learn, every story you listen to, every sentence you understand, you are binding pages together. You are building something real. And one day, when the moment comes, you will be ready to send it out into the world. You do not need to be rich. You do not need a famous school. You just need to keep binding the pages one by one, day by day, story by story. Keep binding, keep reading, keep reaching. There are many more stories waiting right here, and I will be here when you come back. Until next time, take care of yourself and never stop learning.